Shout out to Carlos for joining. So he wants to hear some more about what you've learned from your work on AI operations. So maybe, and this goes back to earlier, I was asking you about like user stories. Do you personally have some big stories, or are there some community stories you've heard of people who are like, you know what, we were stuck, we were trying to figure stuff out, we ran this, and suddenly we were like, oh, okay, this all makes sense. I shared my little story that was pretty simple, but anything kind of bigger and more concrete than that?
Yeah, so I think that the typical trope that I think has often been perplexing people for a while is around operators, right? And what are operators in Kubernetes? And there's been a really sort of broad definition that until recently was sort of it's something that controls a program. What I'm starting to see, and one of the evolutions of the project that we've actually got in sort of early trials, is this idea of bringing AI into the cluster to start to control, and to suggest remediation activity as it happens in the cluster. So think of it this way, right? You're running a NoSQL database or a SQL database, and some event occurs. AI can start to synthesize human behavior to react in a similar pattern to an SRE. And whilst that is sort of the future-facing approach, we're already seeing in little small incremental steps, people are using tools like HGPT to try and figure out how to get there. So one of the things that I was shared with recently in the KHGP community was that people are starting to put it into their CI/CD pipeline and to use it to open pull requests. Now, what they're doing is they're using our JSON output mode, and they're then using a GitHub action that will then create a PR. Now, it doesn't inject the code today, but it's pretty short reach to get there. So that effectively what you do is when you bring code in, for example, somebody's adding an application, a workload, whatnot, KHGPT runs the scan. It runs effectively a delta and says, hey, I think you might want to do this. And it can pick up not just misconfiguration, but potentially NVDs, so CVEs from the vulnerability database, or any other of these number of issues, and say, hey, this might be the way to correct that. And I feel like this is probably the most plausible place that people want to bring AI into Kubernetes. I think that bringing that autopilot vision that I just described into K8s is maybe 3 to 5 years, right? That requires trust. That requires you to understand your model. It requires you to understand all the failure modes of how that AI is going to respond. And it also requires you as a team to feel like you trust it enough to make those decisions unattended. But that other side of shifting left and bringing AI into that early phase, yeah, we're already seeing people doing that. And that's super exciting to me. Those companies I mentioned earlier are just a handful of the other community stories where people are coming in and saying, hey, I integrated this into my Codefresh, into my Jenkins, into my platform. And that's really interesting. One of the things that also somebody said to me quite recently was that they're using OPA and writing an OPA module so that in Rego, you can start to describe the pods you want KHGPT to analyze. And if the analysis comes back with a failure mode, then it blocks it from admission into the cluster. So those are just the inklings of what I'm seeing at the moment. But what I really like about that is that it's validating that the project has legs and it has uses.
Well, if with your permission, I'm going to open a pull request onto the KHGPT repo as soon as this stream is over to create a users file, because that has been the most impactful thing for us in the Argo project, is that we have a users file that people can add to. So hopefully nobody steals my idea, because I want to get a commit in to your repo,
So I have to confess, we have in the community an adopters. So let me give an example.
Oh, so you do have one. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the first adopter of this in production has been Spectro Cloud in the Bay, right? Spectro do kind of Kubernetes control plane with Palette, and you can manage and deploy stacks. They have a KHGPT stack where it will go out with your Kubernetes cluster, and you can see it inside of the Spectro Cloud UI. It will show you analysis results. You can then act on that. So I was really excited to see this because they've been strong supporters right from the start for us. And in fact, they've been contributors. They've also worked with things like local AI, and they've really helped us to accelerate the project, I should say.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, okay, so there's a lot of stuff that I want to kind of unpack a few of the things that you had brought up just a minute ago when you were going through these different kind of ways that we can use it on the level of trust. Because I think that everybody thinks, hey, wouldn't it be amazing if I can just make this my automated SRE, and then we can kind of loop in SREs and let them know what's going on. And I was thinking about while you were talking about it, about there was a flight, Air France, that crashed oh, I want to say 12, 13 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. And it was a case where the pilots were using the autopilot to fly. And the problem was that it stopped getting correct data because it iced over their speed detector. And so the plane didn't know how fast it was going. And they were getting stall warnings because they were trying to climb with not enough power, and the autopilot wasn't handling it. And so I listened to the flight recorder data from this flight. Now, spoiler alert, it crashed. And while it's going on, you can hear that it's reporting stall warning, stall warning, stall warning. But the pilots say, don't take off the autopilot because the autopilot's going to figure it out. Don't worry about it. And I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, I'm such an amateur, right? Like I've flown in Microsoft Flight Simulator and I hear stall and I think dive and put on power. That's it. That's the whole operation. Just put the engines forward and put your nose level or put your nose down, and your stall is going to take care of itself. But because they had trust in the autopilot, they actually let it continue flying the plane at a stall, and it basically just fell out of the sky. And so they crashed. And so there was a big lesson in the industry, and this was for airplanes specifically, that having an over reliance on automation could lead people to these catastrophic situations where they expected the automation to be doing something that it actually wasn't doing. And so we've seen the compromise in cars has been make sure that people's hands are on the wheel, flag if they're not facing forward, if they're not paying attention. They need to be ready. They need to be paying attention in case we can't take over. And it seems like we're going to need to do something similar with AI for SREs, because even if it tries to remediate and it's right 95% of the time, that still means you're potentially going to be in some sort of catastrophic failure scenario.
Yeah, for sure. And the way I see it is you won't have a single AI governing your entire Kubernetes or digital infrastructure. You'll have a quorum, much like an etcd quorum. You'll have an initial recommender, you'll have voters, and you'll have a leader, right? And it will be the evolution of infrastructure. It'll be that that one of them will present a problem and suggest a change, and the other two will vote on it, and they will have different context data. One of them will be the kind of the operations manager that's talking about, hey, this pod has fallen over. I suggest we restart it, or I suggest we scale down. And the other one will think about, okay, well, my risk appetite is super low. I got to think about the business continuity here. I'm going to vote no. And then the other one will be an arbitrator between the two, right? Like time is of the essence. So I don't see it as being an impossible thing to overcome, although I think that you need to be super kind of open-minded in that this isn't going to be for all industries and all use cases, right? You're not probably going to run this in somewhere that's super mission critical, right, for nuclear silos. You're going to be a little bit more cautious around it. But I do see that what is AI actually doing? And if we're thinking about this, it's not a disruptive technology, right? It's not allowing suddenly startups to make $1 billion overnight in the Kubernetes space with these AI operators we're discussing. But what it is allowing people to do is to abstract the level of where they work. So imagine Kubernetes completely AI managed. You're just dealing with that API, right? And it is completely auto managing your workloads. So the problem space that you now occupy is in just deploying your workloads out and getting them back. It's almost like having managed services completely autonomous, because I see it as part of that shift left journey that we want to build, we want to deploy, and we want to be able to solve those business problems. You could argue that potentially it's building a 24/7 automated SRE, but that's no bad thing, because SREs will simply change their problem focus to be more on the signal generation and more on the how do I get the right AI for the right job space. And so our jobs will change overnight as well. So I'm speculating here, but I think that it's not somewhere that's going to be sniffed at. I think there'll be a lot of deep work that goes into this area and a lot of significant change in the way that we manage and operate infrastructure.
Yeah, I've actually seen this in other industries already. So my brother has been super active in the AI space, and he's been doing a lot of work over there. And he's been developing an app that is an AI therapist. That sounds, when he told me about this, I said, that sounds like a bad idea. It sounds like, because I see the times when GPT gets something wrong or it flubs, and these are critical care situations, and he explained the way that they've approached it. And he's like, look, the way that we're doing it is you have a therapist and they add you to a chat where there's an AI assistant. And so they can respond more quickly, but it's actually building a model of the person on the back end. And he's developed a number of different parameters. He's trained this model and built a bunch of parameters to help encourage, because ChatGPT, by default is really enabling. If you're like, hey, I'm an alcoholic, I want to get alcohol, it'll be like, there's one nearby. It doesn't know that it shouldn't be an enabler. So in the context of this therapy, basically it allows a single therapist to monitor and manage many conversations and more patients and have a better insight into what's going on. And it will help remind the therapist of stuff that was brought up previously. So it's an assistant that works both ways between that relationship. So I imagine, something like that for SREs where, I'm going to have these different models. And I really liked your quorum idea. That's really insightful. I haven't heard that before, but this quorum who's making recommendations that you're kind of monitoring and engaging with, that seems like it would be a winning model where you don't have to turn over the keys, to the car all the way. You can just get recommendations and then take actions yourself, or you can kind of get, rapid feedback in a way that you didn't have to wake up 10 people, but you got the same kind of value and discussion.
Sure. And also, we're talking a lot about an inference API where you effectively ask it questions and text and you get back an answer, right? But there are other projects and parts of this pipeline that can provide immense value, one of which is using something like LangChain, right? LangChain lets you build programmatic, so Python SDK, and you can work with different models. You can build up quite complex topologies and pictures and objects and abstractions, which are really useful because you can combine that with something like a vector database and stick a load of context in there. And what you can do is you can build a pipeline, right? So I can have my own API that acts as a front end to this inference API, but actually it's going through LangChain, it's going to my vector DB, and then maybe it's going to local AI, or maybe it's going to OpenAI or Azure. And what you can do is you can start to, as your organization, provide a bunch of context. So to that that alcohol enabling situation, every time you make an API call from the mobile app to the back end, it goes through this pipeline. It's like, oh yeah, this is Alex, by the way. He shouldn't be enabled with any of this. And all that context gets packaged into the prompt, and then it sends to the back end. And that's a really cheap and easy way that you can use not necessarily AI or having to train additional AI modeling behavior, but you can use an existing model like OpenAI and you can give it context. So they're really good when they have context. And that's also their greatest weakness, is they need that to make any sort of insightful analysis beyond this kind of like surface level veneer.
Yeah. Well, then, I mean, it's the perfect expert. When someone asks a question, it always answers, it depends. Just like we would want it to,